about today, so trauma-informed coaching, and I want to encourage you from an athlete perspective, a coach perspective, as a clinical counselor and a clinical supervisor, which is basically just a fancy word that I get to teach graduate students and therapists how to be therapists and get their required hours. So I get about 50 graduate students that come and train under me. I own a mental health clinic in Kelowna, British Columbia. I have a 17-person therapist team. So we see a little bit of everything. We do somatic therapy, we do EMDR, specialized trauma therapy, we do attachment work. So all of these things that were just talked about, we see in the clinical sense. And then I really love working with athletes, given my background. And I believe as humans, we all have stuff. So we're gonna look at that through that lens, and then I wanna encourage you that you do not have to be a trauma expert, but you can be trauma informed. And what does that really look like working with athletes? But I would even zoom out that and say working with people, because as Tracy noted, to some extent we all have some trauma in our lives. It could be big T trauma, abuse, big accidents. We're usually the first call on, there was a big crane accident in our town, in our city, and it was just terrible, big construction building. We were the first on scene to do some crisis debriefing and trauma counseling. But that little T trauma can also come at, that could be injury, bullying, identity, home life that you have nothing awareness at. You don't even know that about your athlete. And so I get to work alongside University of British Columbia. I was a coach there, and now I'm in Kelowna, so I'm at another campus up there, and that's where I have a practice. But what we notice, and I come in and I talk a lot on, is we're noticing, there's a book called Anxious Generation. If you have not read it, I highly recommend it, by Jonathan Haidt. But we were noticing that 21 is actually more like 14. Like these 21-year-olds that we're seeing in university, these athletes, these students, they were actually more like 14, stunted emotionally. Because they did not have the coping skills, they did not learn things that we thought maybe they would have to build that window of tolerance. So today we're going to talk about the biopsychosocial approach, and that's what we look at as a whole person, the holistic athlete. So we're going to look at the different realms, so biological, psychological, social, and spiritual, and that's all encompassing and rooted in Christ. And then we're going to look at the 4 F's. Have you guys heard of that? The fight, the flight, the freeze, the fawn, and then we're going to add faith as a protective factor. So I added 1. We're going to do a 5 of them. So that's what we're going to look at today to help you have a little bit of practical takeaways of trauma-informed coaching. Because yes, there's generational sin, there's generational trauma, that's the term we use in clinical psychology, generational trauma, but I also want to impart on you that there's generational healing. And what if an athlete's story and an athlete's healing starts in your team? Starts with you being present. Okay, so I was an athlete. I found my identity in hockey. I came up through Team USA. I played at Ohio State, won a couple national championships, and I had a career-ending wrist injury. So I gotta wear my watch a little down here because I got a bunch of metal, and sometimes that gets a little funky. But my whole identity was shattered. Who am I? What am I good at? And we had sports psychologists. I worked with probably one of the top in the NHL at the time at that point. But like Tracy, no one asked me how I was doing. How are you really? How are you coping? We talked about visualizing, we talked about getting back out there, and I tried 3 times unsuccessfully. So my whole identity was shifted. And God really, really did redeem that. And I transitioned into coaching. I coached at Ohio State, my alma mater, and then I moved to Vancouver. I coached at UBC, and then in Kelowna, and getting to really pour in to the players around me, it was really, really beautiful. He really did redeem that. But I noticed something. I loved teaching skill, I loved coaching, but I noticed that everybody had a story and had some stuff, and I wanted to help them. So I went back and got my master's in counseling psychology and got licensed and trained in that, because while I was at UBC, one of our goaltenders was also in medical school, super high achieving, on the outside, functioning very high level, you would not even notice, but she took her own life. And from that, we started this sports counseling fund, where every team at UBC had a counselor. Come in and we do team sessions, we'd have option one-on-one kind of drop-in sessions, and it really grew to care for that holistic individual person. What's really going on in your world? How How are you doing? Like athletes who is injured, the biological part. How are you sleeping? How are you eating? It's all interconnected. You pull on one, you pull on the other. Psychologically, emotionally. When there's like a stressor that maybe is like this big or this big, but your reaction is this big, it's usually a trauma response. So what's really going on? How are you really doing? Because do you know the #1 predictor of successful sport teams? So on the clinical side, on the mental health, mental professional, and performance side, I work with high performance youth to NHL, Olympic athletes across sports, professional athletes. Do you know the #1 predictor of success among high achieving, high performance teams? No, some of you were here earlier, so maybe you know. It's not skill, it's not even team culture, it's not leadership, it's not coaching, it's not any of that. It's not resources. It's psychological safety. Psychological safety. Feeling seen, feeling heard, feeling safe, attuning to the person next to you. My story after my whole identity and who am I and God, what's my purpose? And I think everyone around those ages, or at least throughout some point in your life, asks that. And I can't tell you what my mentor, what my supervisor, what my counselor, here's my pastor, what he did clinically, like the interventions that he did. I know he's a cognitive behavioral therapist specialist, fancy word. I can tell you he was present. So you do not have to be a trauma expert to be trauma informed to look after your athletes. Okay, let's go. So this is that biopsychosocial model. So the biological, so we want basic needs to be met. When there's trauma, we get stunted. We stop looking after simple things like showering, hygiene, all of that. We want to look at the psychological part of the person, of the athlete, their history, your self-concept, your identity. Everybody has one. Where are you finding your identity? Normally it's performance in athletes. You want to look at the social. Hurt does not happen in isolation. It often happens because of someone else or because of yourself and in a relationship, or the lack of, how Tracy talked about what you didn't get. How your parents couldn't show up for you because they just could not. Doesn't make it right or make an excuse, they could not. But the social part, healing always happens in connection. And I think that's so important. That can happen with you. You being that for the athlete. And then of course the spiritual. And in psychology, we look at it as meaning and purpose. How do you equate meaning? How do you make purpose? You know, this definition of trauma, too much, too soon. Something that overwhelmed me to the point of not feeling in control. What meaning do I give that? What purpose do I say now I have? We also have a term called post-traumatic growth. So there's post-traumatic stress disorder that I think you've probably all heard of, PTSD or CPTSD, complex trauma. There's post-traumatic growth, which is basically resilience, but you don't just come back to where you were before. There's a fact, there's a redemption, there's a beauty, there's a rising. And so I really love that. So I want to look at some of the behaviors that you might see in your athletes. So you might see a behavior as uncoachable. Maybe that root is that freeze or the flight. So we have the fight, the flight, the freeze, the fawn. Fawn is basically people pleasing, saying yes when you really need no. And this is what, as a coach or as a safe, trusted person, what you could do. You can build trust. You can go at a slow pace, slow down, attune, be present. If you cannot be present with yourself, how can you be present with another person? And starting that of just being present with God, spending time with Him, soaking with Him. So you might see behavior as too intense, maybe just that over-aggressive athlete. That could be the fight response coming up. So this is what you could do. Stay grounded, set limits, take a deep breath, calm that nervous system, come back online. Look for 5 blue things in the room. Get that brain back online. One more that I'll look at is maybe the lazy. So just, don't want to do it, kind of showing up late, sluggish. A likely root could be the freeze response. So what you could do then, simplify. Support regulation. So simplify, break it down into a smaller task. When we hit that, we're gonna hit a dopamine. We'll kind of feel good, that positive reward. We'll get it going a little bit more. So trauma-informed coaching, caring for athletes as whole people, be curious. In your athlete's story, I would try not to just see the stats, but be curious. What happened in your life to get you to this point? When someone lashes out, be curious. What's the hurt underneath that? It's often like an iceberg. You'll see a response, but that's just like a little tip of it, but way underneath is it insecurity, worry, fear, trauma. What does that look like? And being safe as a strategy. So psychological safety builds trust, resilience, and then long-term performance. So you actually do, when you attune to the whole person, get the total athlete too. And then faith and compassion. So trauma-informed coaching can really mirror how Christ is. There's truth but a tenderness. Strong but gentle is what I like to say. There's boundaries but with grace. Okay, I'm just gonna go to, so this is that iceberg. I like to think of all behavior as a communication. I have 4 little kids. Behavior is a communication. It's often an unmet need, even in 20-year-olds, even in older athletes, even on us adults. Behavior is a communication. It's often of an unmet need. What do I need right now? So again, these types of trauma that you can see could be family stress. You don't know what's going on in there, or relationship stress, something like that. And then you're seeing lazy, unmotivated, angry, and really what's underneath is shame. And shame dies when stories are told in safe places. And Boss Camp said that, and I love that so much. Shame dies when stories are told in safe places. Okay, so I'm gonna look at this a little bit for you for some practical takeaways, so you can take a picture of this if you'd like. But this is what trauma could look like in athletes with those 5 F's. So we have the fight, flight, freeze, fawn, and then the faith as a protective factor. So we've kind of looked at a couple of those, but let's say we'll go at the fawn example here. So what you could see, over apologizing, approval seeking, people pleasing. I love, just trying to talk about fitting in. And the worst thing that can happen is that you do, because you're not being true to who you are, authentic, safe, grounded. And then how we could reframe that, belonging, authenticity. The coach strategy could be you're affirming your athlete's voice. What you say matters. Great point. It does not have to be mind-blowing. It can just be validating. Hey, thank you for speaking up. You really contribute. What you say really matters to our team. And allowing no. That's huge. A lot of athletes feel that pressure to perform, and so they overdo their yes. And I think it was said yesterday in the panel, and I love this concept, that every yes has various no's attached to it. And likewise, every no has various yeses. But really be discerning with the Holy Spirit of what is your best yes. And then a coach example of what that could look like. Hey, it's okay to speak up. Your input matters. And then if we were to look at faith, a long research shows that faith is a resistance, is a resilient factor, is a protective factor against any mental health issue, but particularly trauma. And so what you could see there is an athlete who's really walking out their faith and how you're coming alongside of them. They're calm, they're rooted, they're grounded, they play free. And how we could reframe that, hey, you're a stabilizer. You're really needed, you're an anchor on our team. Don't bypass that. The coach strategy, hey, encourage spiritual identity and rhythms. You're more than your performance, play from that place. Okay, so a few more things, my other little color-coded note I'll give you that you can take a picture of if you'd like. But a few of the coping strategies then, when you're in one of these fight, freeze, flight, fawn responses, basically when you're not in your window of tolerance. I usually equate it to Goldilocks and the three bears, like too low, too small, too hot, when I jump out the window kind of thing. And so what are some things that we can do to get back in that window of tolerance? And again, back to that story of just sitting with athletes, being someone who gets to hear stories. It's not me fixing them. In fact, that's not what I do at all. It's being present. Most people don't want fixing. They just want to feel seen and heard and validated and valued and loved for who they are. That might be the first time they're really seen. And that healing can happen a good look at that trauma-informed coaching, some of the practical strategies, looking for those responses, being curious. What is that behavior communicating? What's the issue behind the issue? What's really going on here? What's happened in your life, in your story to get you to where you are now? And knowing that you do not have to fix them. There are times, gut check, discern. If things are out of your scope, out of your lane, that's where you have resources to come alongside professional help. And there's no harm in that. In fact, that's the most loving thing you can do. And to refer out. So that was the story there. And so I'll give you 3 things to kind of leave with. So how to support athletes with trauma, how to walk with them in your lane. Name it to tame it. Has anyone heard of that? Okay, so often trauma does show up differently than anxiety or depression or things like that in our body. Our body usually tells us before our mind goes in. Like we're just going, especially athletes, those high achievers, they just go. And so if we can name it, we can tame it. The idea is then we can get above, like I am feeling, I'll show you this feeling wheel that I like to use. But this is from Calm, that app. But really our core emotions, if you can name an emotion, and normally it's not just one, there might be a couple, and I like to rate it out of 100%, so it's not all or nothing, it's on that staircase, and where in my body do I feel it? So name it to tame it, helps you get above, over it, get a helicopter view perspective, instead of feeling underneath it, overwhelmed and controlled by it. So emotions are indicators, not controllers. They're indicating to us, hey, something needs to happen here. And then reset routines. Teach short rituals after a mistake. Mistakes happen in sports. I was a goalie. I learned way more from when I got scored on. Did not have a shutout every game. That's not realistic. But I would have reset routines. And so teaching short rituals after mistakes. A deep breath. Reset that nervous system. Touch the ground. An action. Kind of cues to the brain. Hey, switch gears here. So a reset routine so that those little stressors don't turn into those big reactions. You're able to respond healthily. And then finally, that mind, body, spirit check-in. How's my body today? Get back into your body. Get back in. Where am I feeling it? What's tingly? Where am I holding this? What's taking up space in my mind? Okay, Lord, I'm going to take every thought captive and give it over to you, Christ. This is what that looks like. And then walking alongside each other. Because again, healing happens always in connection with yourself, with your body, with others, and with God. So thank you all for listening, and hopefully you can take one of those little trauma-informed coaching to lean into and practice.